Who the hell knows? Let's see. Maybe I'll just be sitting in front of a blue thing the whole time. Got a green screen. Well, it's green on the other side. Whoa. I don't know what I'm going to do with this. I guess we'll find out. Have fun editing, Tom. I hope you find some cool things to do with this and that it wasn't just pointless. Why did you do it? I don't know what else. Picking up from last time, spells. That's what we're going to be talking about this week. I already talked a little bit about spells in the stuff I shot last week, so we'll be jumping between what I didn't show you then and whatever I'm going to show you now. Spells are actually one of my favourite elements of Homebrew to craft in D&D. There are already a ton of spells in the game, but there are more than a few. That's right, I'm looking at you, True Strike, Blade Ward, Friends, Barkskin, Witchbolt, Fine Traps, Flame Blade, Ray of Enfeeblement, Grasping Vine, Instant Summons, Mordenkainen Sword, and Weird, that miss the mark or don't seem to be quite worth investing in. We could certainly implement some home rules to fix those spells, and recently I've started doing so in my games, but there is also still always room for more spell options, which I talked about last week. Over to you last week, Tom. Making spells is a similar process to making items, and you might even find that you want to make a spell that is granted by your item. So to start with, we want to do what we did before and just jot down some ideas. In this case, we've made it easy for ourselves. I've chosen a character that already has some abilities that we can just try to replicate. He can raise his little ghoul guys, make a barrier to trap his enemies. He can throw mist at people, which attracts his little ghoul guys and makes them swarm the target. And his ultimate ability is to summon the Maiden of the Mists, who is a sort of scary, more powerful undead follower of his. Loads to work with there. So with spells, more so than with items, we want to make sure that we don't make something that is too close to an existing spell in the game. That's just more work to do for no reason. Taking the first of Yorick's abilities, where he can raise the ghouls, we already have a few spells like Animate Dead, Dance Macabre, and Create Undead that have similar effects at varying power levels. But there's definitely still room to make something new here. But let's have a look at the other things he can do. He has a trapping ability. Again, we've got a few ways to do similar things in D&D, but not this exact ability. So functionally, it's not much different from something like Ensnare. It doesn't create a barrier necessarily, but it tangles enemies in place and stops them from moving. You know, more or less the same thing. You could just slap a different kind of description of the look of the spell onto that, and you've basically got the same sort of effect. So I'm going to leave that one and move on from there. However, if we were to spend more time, we could definitely come up with something unique to represent this ability of Yorick's if we really wanted to. Now this next ability is interesting. He throws mist at an enemy, and if they are hit with it, any of his ghouls that are nearby immediately chase down and attack that target. In-game, this is a really powerful ability if Yorick already has a bunch of little ghoul guys nearby. So looking at this spell or ability here, we've got a sort of area of effect, but it doesn't have a huge range. We could change that if we needed in order to better balance the spell, but for now let's just stick as close as we can to the original representation in the game. A cone area is probably the best fit, and it's the kind of effect that an enemy could just run or dive out of the way from, so we should probably have a dexterity save for our targets to avoid the effect of the spell. As for the spell's effect, there are a few things that we could look to do depending on how powerful we want the spell's effect to be. Spell power is a bit more defined in D&D by the level of the spell. This is useful because you can directly compare spells of similar levels and get a good baseline for the power that your spell should have. Although it does get a bit trickier when we're making spells that don't deal direct damage, because their power level can be a bit harder to quantify, such as like a trapping spell that we've already mentioned, or one that confuses your enemy, or one that maybe stuns them or does something like that. But we'll look at all of that in a later video when we talk about balancing in more detail. Hello, it's me again. So I decided last week to make a spell for us to look at based on one of Yorick's abilities, and I liked that mist ability that we just talked about the most, so that's what I decided to make. Right, so the first one that we have here is Morning Mist. I have made it a 4th level spell, but as we go through the different ones that I'm going to show you, the different versions of this, it will become more and more apparent that I have made really no attempt at the moment to seriously think about balancing. We're going to leave that for later. We're starting with Morning Mist here. As I said, a 4th level spell, but we can forget about that for the moment. And it's a necromancy spell. That seemed to just fit with the theme of Yorick's ability. Not worrying too much about that at the moment again. A casting time of 1 action. If we look at Yorick's ability, we can see that he pretty much just goes meh with some mist. He doesn't sort of have a big wind up where he sort of goes like in, I don't know, Dragon Ball Z or something like that. I don't watch Dragonborn Z. Dragonborn Z? Oh my god. See? I don't watch it. But even I've heard of the ridiculousness of their sort of powering up and the time that it takes them to do that. Most spells and effects that have an immediate effect on the battlefield or on the target have a casting time of an action. Range. Now, range is something that we can use to balance a little bit as we start to think about that in the future. But for now, I just took basically what we can see in Yorick's ability that we looked at. He just sort of hurls this ball of mist and it kind of explodes in a bit of a cone. That seemed a bit odd to have a range which then turns into a cone. You could definitely do it. I just decided I was going to simplify things, and instead of making it a cone, I just made it a 10-foot wide cube. And the duration. So the duration of the spell is up to 1 minute, which is a pretty long time in combat, but not a very long time out of combat. And the stipulation that it is concentration is important. That's actually something that you want to know if you're going to be creating spells, is whether or not you want them to be concentration spells. In this case, it seemed appropriate, as we'll see the spell has a lingering effect. So, what does this spell do? You hurl a handful of deathly mist at a point within range. As we said, that's 30 feet. Creatures caught within the spell's area, which is the 10-foot cube, must make a dexterity saving throw to avoid the effect. On a failed save, the creature has its movement speed halved for the duration as the mist clings to them, which represents the slowing effect that we talked about that the ability has in League of Legends. In addition, attack rolls made against the creature have advantage as long as the attacker can see them. Successful attacks made by undead against a creature affected by the spell will automatically critically hit. So, a couple of things about this spell that make it interesting, but also a couple of things that might not make it ideal. It's quite close to another spell that exists in the game, a 1st level spell I believe, called Fairy Fire. Now what Fairy Fire does is it sort of explodes in glowy green or blue light, which then settles on creatures within the area, makes it impossible for them to become invisible, and grants creatures advantage on attacks against them. We're kind of treading into the territory of that spell already. We might want to consider whether this is actually necessary or whether we could just as easily use that spell to get the same effect. We've changed it a little bit. Creatures are still able to become invisible, but they are slowed down a little bit. And also, if they happen to be being attacked by undead, it's particularly bad news for them. But even still, it's not that different to something that already exists in the game. The next one is called Mist's Call. Again, I've call it a 5th level necromancy, but we don't need to worry about that. It's probably slightly more powerful than the previous one. This one has a range of 60 feet and the cube is 15 feet, so it's a bit of a bigger area that you can cast this over. Same duration of a minute, also concentration. And the description of this one is a little bit different and possibly a little bit more faithful to the actual spell in League of Legends. You choose a point within range and command your undead followers to converge on creatures there, creating a grasping mist in the area. Creatures caught in the spell's area must make a dexterity saving throw. On a failed save, they have their movement speed halved, and attacks made by undead creatures against them have advantage for the duration. Undead creatures you control immediately move up to their full movement speed towards the nearest affected creature and make a melee attack against them. While the spell is active, undead creatures you control may add your spell attack modifier to their attack and damage rolls. So really all this one does is mark creatures in the area, make them a bit slower, again as we see in League of Legends, and give undead creatures a chance to immediately catch up to and attack them. Now we see that in the game as well, so when you hit someone with the ability, all of your little ghoul guys that we mentioned before immediately leap towards the enemy and start attacking them. So we've represented that danger of having undead creatures that you control immediately move up and begin to attack them. However, this spell very heavily relies on you having undead creatures under your control. If you don't, it's pretty useless. All it will do is slow them down a little bit and that's it. Definitely not something that you would consider if you didn't have a very specific build that can make use of this spell. Sometimes that might be okay. If the spell is just to go along with a particular build that you want to create, and you're okay with that spell really not having a home anywhere else, that's fine. Let's have a look at the last one that I did. So this one is quite a powerful spell. I decided to make it an 8th level necromancy spell, casting time of 1 action. This time I went with a cone. So cones in general originate from the caster. So this is a 20-foot cone that blasts out forth from the caster. The duration for this one is not concentration and is not 1 minute, but is instantaneous. So a spell with a duration of instantaneous generally has, as you can imagine, an instant effect, but also it can be an effect that causes something to happen, and whatever results from that effect goes on indefinitely. Let's have a look at what this spell does. You send forth a wave of corrupting mist, stirring the dead from their slumber and marking your enemies for death. Creatures you designate in the spell's area must make a Constitution saving throw. On a failed save, the creature takes 68 necrotic damage, or half as much on a success. In addition, creatures that fail the save are restrained by the mist for the duration, requiring a successful strength, athletics, or dexterity acrobatics check against your spell save DC to escape, which they can make at the end of their turns. So rather than just being slowed down by the mist, they are actually restrained and held in place. But creatures caught by it do have the chance to break out of it again at the end of their turn. But they're guaranteed to not be able to move at all for at least 1 turn. Then we have the last section. Corpses of humanoids in the spell's area are risen as ghouls under your command, and for each affected creature in the area, 1 Mistwalker is summoned, also under your control. At the start of an affected creature's turn, any undead within 30 feet of them may use their reaction to move up to 30 feet towards them and make a melee attack against them. Mistwalkers may do so even if they have already used their reaction. So a few things here that are a bit different, a little bit interesting. They've already made their Constitution saving throw. If they succeed, they take half of the 68 necrotic damage, and other than that, they're fine. They're unaffected by the rest of the spell. However, if they fail, they become completely restrained within this mist until they are able to break out at the end of their turn by making another check to escape. If they don't escape though, they're in a lot of trouble because at least some Mistwalkers are coming after them, if not some ghouls if there were already corpses in the area. Now, Mistwalkers are not actually a creature that exists in D&D, so we would have to then go and create for ourselves a Mistwalker undead creature that we think is the appropriate power level and has the appropriate attacks and things like that. Which is fine. Actually, it works out pretty well because in a few videos time we're going to be talking specifically about how to homebrew for making creatures, which is one of my favourite things to do, and we can use our Mistwalker as one of our examples to look at. This spell, as well as damaging the enemy and marking them to be attacked by undead and restraining them, actually also creates some undead that can then go and attack them. So you don't have to rely on having already summoned undead. You can actually just go ahead and blast out this spell, throw up some undead Mistwalkers, and immediately start attacking the enemies. So there are a lot more types of characters for whom this might actually be useful, as opposed to just specifically a necromancer wizard build or a grave cleric build. Those are just another 3 examples that I've thrown together to give you an idea of what can be done. So let's go back to last week, Tom, to bring this video home and tell you what we're going to talk about next week. If we want to make a class or a subclass for Yorick in D&D, we can. I think what I'll do next week is actually build a homebrew paladin subclass of Yorick, and we can go through it from top to bottom and I can talk through each element. Unless I do that and it's just really boring. Do you like this kind of content? Is it interesting? Is it useful? Either way, let me know, because I'm still figuring this out and I'm happy to try something new if you'd find it more engaging. A Tom of every kind, every flavour this week. I realised I didn't actually record an outro because I stupidly thought that my outro from last week would do, but I've already used that. So that's what I'm doing now. I don't really have anything to say except that I will see you next week. So until then, have fun and be good.